Everyone, this is Nick Brano with MPP-TV, and I'm very lucky to be joined today by Richard Hobbs of Human Agenda. Richard Hobbs is here to talk to us today about the historic results in Mexico's election earlier this month, where the new progressive party, Morena, swept the presidency, the legislature, the governorships, and the mayorships in this month's federal election. And they threw out the establishment parties that have ruled Mexico for 100 years. So really impressive results. Richard was actually there as an official election observer. So we're very lucky to have him on today to tell us about it. And before that, I want people to really understand what the political situation is like in Mexico. You're an expert, Richard, on the political scene, and the incredible corruption that paralyzes Mexico. And so if you could tell people about that and really put into context how incredible Morena's victory and Lopez Obrador's victory, the incoming president, has been.
Yes, I lived in Mexico for 5 years, actually quite a while ago, and I wrote a 600-page thesis on corruption in Mexico. We can honestly say that the ruling party for almost the last 100 years, the Institutional Revolutionary Party that was founded in 1929, has held a monopoly on power and has used what's called the dedazo, where they basically name the next president and win every single election. That's been true except for 2 election periods in 2000 and 2006, when a right-wing business party, the PAN, the National Action Party, won the elections. And then in 2012, the current president, Peña Nieto, won and has instituted another series of privatizations that have been tormenting Mexico, not only for the last few years, but actually for the last 50 years. To give a little bit of history about the economy of Mexico, in the 1930s, there was the nationalization of oil and railroads and the formation of large unions that were protecting people's lives. However, by the 1980s, the pre-presidents decided to basically privatize the economy. In 1982, there were 2,100 state sector enterprises in Mexico, and by the year 2000, they had privatized 900 of those. So there were only a couple of hundred enterprises left. And under the Peña Nieto government, they have privatized not only oil, which was the mainstay of the Mexican economy for the last 90 years, but also telecommunications and electricity. And so what we're seeing in Mexico is the result of the International Monetary Fund's policies. There are structural adjustment programs that have required the Mexican governments to privatize their economies, to take away healthcare and education services for the people, and to reduce the minimum wage. And so over a period of decades, the poverty that has increased to a point of 54% of the Mexican population, which lives in either poverty or extreme poverty, has meant very few opportunities in order to actually survive in Mexico. And that's why we've seen a plethora of gangs, of cartels, and of violence in Mexico in the last number of years. Since the year 2000, there have been 200,000 people killed in Mexico, and over 26,000 disappeared. 99% of the cases of the disappeared have never been investigated. And so impunity is what has replaced corruption in Mexico. In last year alone, in 2017, there were 75 tourists like you or me going to Mexico who were killed. In the rest of the world, there were only 69 American tourists that were killed. So the level of not only corruption, but violence and impunity is the highest it's ever been in Mexico, and it's one of the most unsafe countries on planet Earth right now.
It's remarkable that in that context, they were able to really produce a political revolution of their own, for a new party to come about to take on both of the establishment parties, even in the wake of what's been reported a tremendous amount of election fraud, attempts to stifle the vote. You were there as an election observer, Richard. Can you tell us what you saw?
Yes, I was an observer in a poor area of Mexico City. The polls were supposed to open at 8 o'clock. Only about 1/3 of the poll workers were there. And so they had to grab people from the line and make them poll workers in order to be able to open the polls about 2 hours late. By the time the polls opened, there were a number of people in line who had to leave and go to work, so they didn't vote. And then in the afternoon, I visited 2 other polling stations, which are called casillas especiales. These are special voting places for people who happen to be outside of their home state the day of the election. And at these casillas especiales, there were at least a couple of thousand people in line in each voting booth, and only 750 ballots. So at each casilla especial that we went to, there were at least 1,000 people that were unable to vote. This has been the same in terms of election history in Mexico since 1990, when they limited the number of ballots to 750 in these casillas especiales. So really, over the years, hundreds of thousands of people have been denied the right to vote. In addition to what I saw, there were also instances, they weren't widespread, but there were instances of votes that were stolen, and some, at least 10 precincts that were not able to open at all in the state of Jalisco. So there were a number of irregularities. I was, quote unquote, trained by the National Institute of Elections in Mexico. However, they did not have any complaint form, so that if we did witness an irregularity, there was no way to report it. And so that in itself is a form of corruption.
So you said that they had only 750 ballots per precinct. What is that ostensibly intended to prevent election fraud?
Well, it works okay if there are 750 people on the voting rolls, which was true in most of the precincts throughout the country. However, in these special voting booths, the casillas especiales, they don't know how many people will vote because these are people who happen to be in Mexico City the day of the election, or they happen to be in Ciudad Juarez the day of the election, or Tijuana the day of the election. These are all over the country, but they only allow 750 ballots at each polling place. And as a result, thousands of people cannot vote. It's actually been in the law since 1990, and the ruling parties have never tried to fix that. In fact, I was in Mexico in 2012, 6 years ago, as an election observer, and exactly the same thing happened. One of the reasons I wanted to go on July 1st this year was to see if they could fix the problem. They did not want to fix the problem, and they did not fix the problem. We're hoping that under Lopez Obrador, they'll pay attention to these casillas especiales and finally allow more than 750 ballots so that everyone in Mexico can vote for president. I was in one casilla especial where the almost all young voters actually occupied the precinct, the voting area, the polling place, stood on tables and yelled obscenities at the electoral officials, and then decided to march on the headquarters of the National Electoral Council and sat down on a major thoroughfare and blocked the highway. So a lot of young people in particular were very upset at what happened in Mexico.
Richard, can you talk too about the US's role? You're also an immigration attorney in the San Jose area, and you're the head of Human Agenda. And in both of those capacities, you work a lot with immigrants, and you see the impact of US policy in determining and having created the state of Mexico. And so I wonder if you could tell people, too, how is it that U.S. policy has created the current state of Mexico, including the corruption that has crippled it?
When I studied in Mexico, the dominant political theory at the National Autonomous University of Mexico was called the dependency theory. And not only did it explain that corporations from the US were exploiting Mexican workers, but that the level of profits was really 3 times greater than the level of profits in the United States. It was called super exploitation, and this super exploitation has never ceased. Direct US investment controls the Mexican economy. Recently, under Peña Nieto, the government decided to allow 100% domination of the telecommunications industry, all aspects of it, by US investors. I think perhaps the most telling story about Mexico, and something that I continue to see in my daily work as an immigration attorney, is the effect of NAFTA. The North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect on January 1st, 1994. At that time, actually, I was part of the labor movement in San Jose, California, and we were trying to convince then Congressman Norm Mineta, a Democrat, not to support NAFTA. However, he did support NAFTA, and the result for the countryside in Mexico was devastating, because you may know that in the United States, we taxpayers subsidize American corn growers to the tune of $6 to $10 billion a year, and this has been going on for decades. So we have the most subsidized corn in the world by far. We also have the most productive machinery to produce corn. And then in 1994, with NAFTA, for the first time, the Mexican government decided that it would not protect Mexican corn growers anymore with tariffs. And so once there were no more tariffs, the US subsidized and highly productive corn flooded the Mexican markets and reduced the selling price of corn for 15 million corn growers in Mexico by 70%. When 70% of their income was lost, they, of course, needed to find other work. And that's when we saw mass migration to the United States of America, to the tune of about 5 million people have come to the United States because they have lost their livelihoods due to NAFTA. Another 5 million went to the largest cities in Mexico, like Mexico City, Monterrey, the border areas, Tijuana. But there was a massive loss of jobs and actual income because of NAFTA. And I see it every day in my immigration practice.
And that's why Lopez Obrador has said that his approach is going to be, and Morena's approach, their approach to tackling poverty is going to be to increase and also to tackling the immigration issues between the United States and Mexico is going to be to tackle that economic inequality, right? That's been the basis of his platform. So could you tell us too, what else is it that that Morena ran on, and what do you think made them so successful?
Well, first of all, Lopez Obrador himself was a founder of the alternative party in the late 80s called the Revolutionary Democratic Party. In 1988, the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, who actually nationalized the oil industry in the 1930s, won the election in 1988 as a PRD presidential candidate. However, there was a slight computer glitch that night, and it turned out he didn't win after all. As a leader in the PRD, Lopez Obrador was the mayor of Mexico City from 2000 to 2005, and he was the presidential candidate of the PRD in 2006, which most people believe he won, and also 2012. Once the PRD became clearly corrupted, just as the PRI, the dominant party, and the PAN, the business-friendly party, it became clear to Lopez Obrador about 5 years ago that a new party needed to be developed. And less than 4 years ago, the Movement for National Regeneration, or Morena, was established. At that time, Morena decided to allow new Morenistas to come in from all of the other political parties. And so people came from the PRI, from the PAN, and from the PRD into Morena, and it became a huge popular movement for a country and a party with entirely new values that would stem corruption, that would stem violence, and that would create more personal security for people in Mexico. As part of the program of Morena, it's been really important, first of all, to create jobs. In order to create jobs in Mexico, one of the steps that Lopez Obrador just took was to reduce his salary as president by 60%. By reducing his salary as president by 60%, he is telling other people in the government that nobody will earn more than him, and that they will be reducing their salaries, and there will be, the higher ups in government will be recalculating their salaries in order to save money for the government. In addition, under Peña Nieto, the outgoing president, not only did he raise taxes on corporations, but he also raised the level of mordidas, or bribes, that are required to get a contract. And so Lopez Obrador is saying we can save millions and millions of dollars by just cutting out the bribes that are required in order to get any state contract. With that, and with a new emphasis on transparency in government, and attempting to end the cycle of corruption that has gone on for decades in Mexico, the hope is that enough money will be created in order to fund some of the social programs that Lopez Obrador has talked about. These include giving money to high school students that can't afford to survive. They include free tuition at universities and creating more universities so that more young people can actually attend college. It also includes a pension for older people and universal health care and free medicine. Those are some of the initiatives, but the hope ultimately is to establish jobs in Mexico and prevent young people from having to look for gangs or cartels as the answer to their problems.
And you wrote, you just published an op-ed in the San Jose Mercury News just about this. And you talked about the historic nature of the victory and also some of the challenges that he's going to face about the way that the institutions are structured in Mexico. And so could you elaborate on that and what you wrote in your op-ed?
Yes, I studied corruption in Mexico extensively. It is clear that ever since the time of the Viceroyalty, before the 1821 independence movement from Spain, that there was corruption going on. People would buy and sell their positions under the colonial period under Spain. Since that time, police historically have been corrupt through a pyramid of corruption. For example, a beat cop would need to take in X amount of money for bribes in order to give to his superior, to give to his superior, to give to the police chief, for example, of the city of Mexico, Mexico City. That's another example. There have also been many instances of bribery in order to get any administrative task accomplished. And as I mentioned, major contracts have required a bribe. And this is not to mention the fact that department heads or the heads of ministries in Mexico City have had access to tens of millions of dollars, which they have just skimmed off the top and put into their bank accounts. So this is the climate, in addition to a climate of many cartels. For example, in the state of Michoacan, there is La Familia Michoacana. In the state of Jalisco, there's the Next Generation Cartel. In the state of Veracruz, there's the Golfo Cartel. And so these cartels are controlling large areas of Mexico, and they don't even allow people to move from one city to the next. For example, in the state of Michoacan, to go from Apatzingán to Aguililla, you need to go through a checkpoint that is controlled by the cartels, and they may not let you through. So literally, there isn't even freedom of movement. Yeah, in Mexico, these cartels control large parts of Mexico. So the challenge for Lopez Obrador will be to attempt to dismantle these cartels and to at least lower the rate of corruption. Having studied corruption, I honestly don't think as long as we have capitalism that we're not going to have corruption, because corruption really is based on this need to have more. And that's what capitalism is all about, the desire to have more, even though you have plenty. As we saw today in the paper, Mr. Bezos now is $150 billion, the head of Amazon. And so under capitalism, as we know, the concentration and centralization of wealth continues unabated. And that's also true even on a lower level in Mexico in terms of corruption. It's even worse, of course, in a third world country where the desire is to try to consume at the level of the middle class of the United States. And so in order to address corruption in particular and all of the problems of Mexico, Lopez Obrador is going to need a mass movement behind him. Without an organized, constant mass movement on the streets, he's not going to be able to attain his goals. However, right now, I see a lot of interest in continuing that mass movement. There were 30 million people who voted for Lopez Obrador. And if even a part of that 30 million are in the streets and supporting his policies, a lot can be changed.
Something that struck me, I watched his victory speech when he won, and the exuberance of people in the streets upon his victory. They had just been eliminated from the World Cup, and people said, it's okay because we won the fight that mattered.
Correct. And I was in the Zócalo, the big plaza in front of the cathedral in Mexico City, the night that he won and gave his victory speech, where he was very careful. He was not trying to upset the large corporations from the United States or the business community in Mexico by saying he would honor all contracts and only allow legal change, etc. And the very next day, I was in the Zócalo watching Mexico play Brazil. And as soon as Brazil got its second goal, everybody started to leave. But I did hear the comment that, well, at least AMLO won. AMLO is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the new president-elect of Mexico, who takes office on December 1st.
I want to ask you about that conciliatory tone that he struck, though, and about the strategy there, because at the same time, there are others inside Morena who've taken more of a hard line, who've said, well, if it turns out that there's resistance to this change, then things like redistribution of land and nationalizing industries, nationalizing corporations are on the table. There are people in the party who've said that. And so I wonder, do you think that is the approach that is developing in Morena, that this is the initial approach that Lopez Obrador is going to take, and that he would be willing to go to that extent, like we saw in the Mexican Revolution a century ago of nationalizing industries, redistributing land if it was unsuccessful? You know, and that ties into your question about really taking on capitalism inside Mexico.
I believe that Lopez Obrador is an honest candidate who honestly wants to help the people of Mexico. And if he continues with that honesty and with the support of the people, I believe he will go further than what he has laid out so far. Right now, he hasn't wanted to provoke a Venezuela where the capitalist class basically has prevented the sale of food on the streets and created chaos on the ground in Venezuela. He wants to prevent that kind of chaos in Mexico, and so he is calming the markets right now. When he actually takes office on December 1st, I think he'll also take slow steps, methodically trying to create jobs in particular, and offering an amnesty perhaps to people in gangs and cartels. He said he's going to consult with human rights groups, for example, on how to best approach that issue. He's also going to create a new National Guard to try to create a military force that is uncorrupted and that can actually enforce the laws of Mexico, which has not happened for the last 10 years or more. And so I think he's going to take these slow legal steps at first, but just like Fidel Castro in 1959, when the United States government decided that it would not allow the Cuban government to actually go forward with land reform and other reforms, Fidel Castro was not really in any other position but to nationalize the United Fruit Company and other US companies and allow full employment in Cuba. I'm not saying that Mexico will become a Cuba, because I don't think that it would ever be allowed by the United States of America to have a Mexico with nationalizing their economy. However, I do expect that there will be a much stronger state sector under Lopez Obrador. When I was in Mexico, 40% of the GNP belonged to the state, and now it's about 10%. So basically, in the last 40 years, they have privatized large parts of the Mexican economy. And I believe that given the right circumstances, that a more mixed economy will be possible under Lopez Obrador.
So Lopez Obrador could easily frame the renationalization of some of these industries as the reversal of policies which are fairly new in some of those cases. Do you think that he'll do that?
Well, about a year ago, he actually laid out a plan for renationalizing oil in Mexico. The plan was to get a majority of both houses of the legislature in Mexico to agree to place this as a referendum before the people of Mexico and let the people of Mexico vote on whether to renationalize or not. So he has talked about the possibility of renationalizing, and I do think it's possible, but once again, it's going to depend upon how he can consolidate his own party and also get the people of Mexico behind him.
Yeah. Do you think it will come to that?
I do. The contradictions in Mexico are extreme. As I mentioned, the poverty level is at 54%. The minimum wage in Mexico is a little bit more than $4 a day. There are $29 billion of remittances that come from the United States to prop up the Mexican economy, which passed oil as the biggest single contributor to the economy. So now remittances from Mexicans living in the United States is the biggest single support to the Mexican economy. There are a number of indicators that Mexico is a disaster right now. And I do believe that there will be new policies, including raising real wages, including allowing more buying power to retired people, including allowing students a stipend in order to continue living while they go to the university, including healthcare and other educational supports. So I do believe there will be a substantial change. I don't believe it will be revolutionary in the sense of actually transforming institutions, other than perhaps some renationalizations within the Mexican economy. From 1982 to 2000, 900 public enterprises were privatized, and I think he will reverse that trend towards privatization.
Something that a lot of our folks will be wondering. Mexico is the latest case in which you see a new progressive party rise in mostly Western countries, whether it's Greece, whether it's Spain, whether it's France. new parties have arisen and are really dismantling, taking apart, taking huge chunks out, sometimes outright replacing establishment parties, neoliberal parties that have been around for decades. The example in Mexico is one of the most remarkable yet, but in France, it was the same thing that we saw as well, where it was two new parties really that came about. One of them was a new neoliberal party that kind of the establishment created when it realized it was going to lose power. That was Macron, who ended up winning. But there was also Mélenchon, who was the Bernie Sanders, essentially, of France. There was Podemos in Spain, who broke apart Spain's two-party system that has reigned since 1975, since the end of the dictatorship there, broke apart for the first time on the left with Podemos. Same thing in Greece, of course, in 2015 with Syriza and Fintech last year. And so I wonder what lessons do you think that these incredible victories offer? Obviously, what we're pushing for in the United States is the creation of a new progressive party in the US, because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are simply too entrenched. They're overly controlled. And you also have this phenomenon where you have 2 out of 3 Americans, a record number, who are now calling for exactly that.
Well, let me start off by saying that Mexico is not Greece or Spain or France. During the election in Mexico, about 150 people who were part of the electoral process were killed. I have an article right here where they killed a Morena candidate in the state of Guanajuato. About 1/3 of the 150 were actually candidates. And so those who were candidates, many of them stepped down because they were afraid for themselves and their families. The level of repression in Mexico is unprecedented compared to any European election. And I think that really inspires a lot of people, that they're risking their lives, literally, to even run for office and then sometimes vote also. And so that has to be one factor that's a little bit distinguishable from Syriza, Podemos, and the two parties in France.
It makes it all the more remarkable.
It makes it all the more remarkable. It's remarkable that Morena was founded a little bit less than 4 years ago, and that within a 4-year period, they won 10% of the votes in the elections of 2015. And in the last election on July 1st, they won 53% of the national vote. So with that 53%, they won both legislatures, the mayor of Mexico, governorships, etc. It's an overwhelming mandate. The next presidential candidate was Anaya from the PAN, who received 22% of the vote. So the difference between Lopez Obrador, Morena, and the next candidate was 31%. That's an overwhelming mandate, and we hope that that takes Morena and also Lopez Obrador forward with policies that will truly help the Mexican people. Having said that, I think that Morena is an example of how quickly a party with values can win power in a country. I'm hoping that Morena can serve as inspiration to people in the United States to create a third-party option that I know that, as you mentioned, 2/3 of the people in the United States would like to have options and don't have them. And so it's inspiring to have seen a party rise so quickly. Having said that, I think another possible lesson is that at this point, it's a relatively amorphous party. When you move that quickly and take over power, mostly through the inspiration of a single person, in this case, Lopez Obrador, I think there is a concern that you have a program that is consolidated and that continues to meet the values of democracy and equality and cooperation, transparency, that we would hope to see not only in Mexico, but also in the United States. So it's an inspiring mandate. If in the United States we had a third party candidate, if you will, an independent Bernie Sanders, I think that something comparable could be accomplished in this country.
I agree. Even with the additional structural barriers, I think what the examples abroad have, all of the examples, including Mexico, is that each of these new parties has run against the corruption and against the economic inequality that exists. And this is, like you say, it's much more pronounced to an unrecognizable degree inside Mexico. But I think those still create a kind of template for what people are looking for that is not that different in the United States. And I think the variation, that what that would look like in the United States is a party that firmly ran against political corruption here in the US. 93% of people in the US think that money in politics is corruption, and that it has an over-influence. And so it is that kind of thing is, I think, where you can build the kind of cross-ideological coalitions, which is actually similar to the coalition that, of course, Morena put together, even though the other parties were much smaller contributors. So I think that does form the foundation. I wonder what you think about that, Richard.
I do. Honestly, I believe that the Mexican people are so exhausted and tired by the impunity and the corruption and the lack of personal security and the lack of opportunity that Morena and Lopez Obrador were completely ripe for a transformation and a revolution in values in particular. The current president of Mexico, Peña Nieto, was found in a $6 million home suddenly owned by his wife. The level of corruption in the ruling party has always been profound. But if you really think about it, Morena ran and won 53% of the vote, and the three existing parties won less than 40% of the vote between the PAN, the PRD, and also the PRI. To date, the PAN doesn't know what it's going to do because it united with the PRD, which is a left-center party. So a right-center party combined with a left-center party, and they're both totally confused about what to do now because they formed a coalition. They got 22% of the vote. The PRI, the dominant party of Mexico since 1929, got 16% of the vote. And they decided to run a person for president who wasn't even a member of the PRI because they wanted to distance themselves from themselves. And so the level of corruption in Mexico has been so high that what we're seeing is a revolution in values. The question is, can those values be institutionalized in non-corrupt institutions that are more democratic and egalitarian?
Do you believe that the three parties will unite in opposition against Morena?
I don't believe so, because the PRI has such a long history of being the dominant party in Mexico. I don't think that they would unite with another party. However, in Mexican politics, anything is possible. I think that the Morena party will be the target in the next elections 3 years from now, and then in the presidential election 6 years after this election this year. And so we will see if those unholy alliances take place. It's very possible. However, because of the unholiness of the alliances, and we've already seen one that just lost dramatically, I believe that the people can see through these unholy alliances of eclectic coalitions that really don't strive to meet the needs of the people, and they will continue to vote for a party of unity. Jose Marti, who was a great leader of Cuba in the 19th century, said that we need to have unity, but you can't have unity if you don't have a political strategy that will unify the people. And honestly, we cannot unify around corporations. And that's what the PAN and the PRI offer, is unity around corporate dominance. And we might see some parallel here to the United States of America.
Definitely. Richard, last question. I wonder, how do you think that the United States is going to respond if Lopez Obrador begins to take steps that are truly, beginning to redistribute more of the wealth, perhaps renationalize some of the industries? Where do you think corporations in the United States and the U.S. And the administration, the Trump administration, is going to draw the line? And what do you think their succession of responses will be? What do you think, for example, it would take for them to, I agree with you that they would not allow kind of a full socialist state in Mexico, and that they would invade Mexico before they permitted that. And so I wonder what kind of series of steps, and how do you think the American business community and government is going to respond?
I honestly think that any renationalization will create a crisis where not only the Chamber of Commerce of Mexico, but the Chamber of Commerce of the United States will react and put different forms of pressure on Lopez Obrador. That pressure could even go as far as assassination attempts. And there's a lot of people concerned about Lopez Obrador as an individual because he is a symbol. And if the symbol is missing, there may be a difficult transition for Morena. That's why it's so important to consolidate power. Mexico has a long history of caudillos, or strongmen, that have controlled different regions of Mexico and the presidency. And so that's a real concern. I would say that if we have what I would call clean capitalism, that the United States will allow clean capitalism. In fact, U.S. corporations supported Lopez Obrador coming to power, partly because they were paying such high bribes in order to get a contract. And so the current Mexican government is so corrupt that they were willing to raise the taxes on the corporations and raise the level of bribes in order to get contracts, in order to fill their own pockets. That's a very high level of corruption. And anything less than that, which is what Lopez Obrador promises, to not raise taxes and to get rid of the hefty bribes that are paid, I think is very beneficial to the corporate class at this time of the United States and of Mexico.
So there's an interesting tense relationship that you described there between the U.S. business community, desire to, a view that corruption has gotten so out of hand in Mexico that it's even against the business interests in the United States. And so this is going to be interesting to follow and to see also how a new progressive government navigates a series of entrenched institutions and whether they can produce the level of change that is required. It's going to be a statement on the ability of change to be produced through the ballot box in Mexico. So Richard, is there anything that you'd like to leave us with?
No, I really appreciate all of the work of the Movement for a People's Party. I do want to say this, that in Mexico, the new political party is called the Movement for National Regeneration. And so they have incorporated the word movement into the name of their political party. And I hope that the Movement for a People's Party has all of the success in the world.
Thank you, Richard. Fabulous comments. And I echo that last one in particular. This has been MPP-TV with immigration expert Richard Hobbs, who is an election observer in Mexico. And who is reporting back to all of us on Mexico's incredible political revolution. Thanks for joining us again, Richard.
Thank you.
See you all next time.